And today we have with us Rick Loessberg. He has previously written numerous articles on the Kerner Report and conducted an oral history interview of Kerner Commission member Fred Harris for the LBJ Presidential Library. He also had a more than 30-year career working with or for local, state, and federal government and administering many types of programs that the Kerner Report has recommended. Please join me in welcoming Rick to the John Hope Franklin Center.
Thank you, Erin, for the very nice welcome and the introduction. Everybody here at the center over the last few weeks has made me feel so welcome that I really was very excited to come here. It's also a great opportunity. It means a great deal to me to actually be here at the John Hope Franklin Center, not just because of the academic reputation that Duke has, but also the connection that the center has, or the university has, with the Kerner Report. We're here at the John Hope Franklin Center, and I can't think of a more appropriate place of discussing why we're talking about perhaps the most important account on race in America than at a place like the John Hope Franklin Center. There's Dr. Franklin over there on the far left. Why there's a connection between Dr. Franklin and the Kerner Report, besides being perhaps the most preeminent African-American historian of the 20th century, he also helped write Chapter 5 of the Kerner Report, which dealt with African-American history and the historical discrimination that occurred in America since really the beginning of the first colonies. You can see here in his transmittal memo in the draft of the chapter that he prepared, he says this doesn't purport to be a complete history of the African-American experience, but he just tries to highlight the key events that are responsible for the attitudes and the emotions of African-Americans in 1967 and 1968. What's noteworthy about Chapter 5 is that the information that was in that really wasn't available in almost any college or high school textbook at the time. It also helped present African-American history to a wide audience that otherwise would not have gone looking for it. This is how most of America found out about the Kerner Report. 1.6 million copies of this paperback book were sold within 90 days. It outsold even the first 90 days of the Warren Report about John F. Kennedy's assassination. So this enabled a lot of America to find out about things about African-American history that they'd never ever encountered. There's also another connection between Duke University and the Kerner Report. John Koskinen was a 1961 graduate from Duke. He also became, several years later, the special assistant to the Commission's deputy executive director. And in that capacity, he was one of about 4 people who knew more about how the Kerner Commission did its work than anyone else on the face of the earth. As an aside, I told John that I was coming here, and I told him that I would really try really hard not to say something that would make the university want to revoke his degree. He said not to worry about that. He also said that I had his approval if I wanted to overemphasize the importance that he had with the commission. But as you can see here, these are the highlights of his resume. Just the highlights, and only some of them. John's career needs no embellishment on my part. Now, looking out over the room, I want to ask you people one question. How many of you, prior to, let's say, seeing the notice for today's discussion, had even heard about the Kerner Report, or even its famous Two Societies warning? Well, I'm surprised that there's that many, but that's probably indicative of the academic reputation that Duke has. 2/3 of America was not born in 1967 or 68. So to them, it's something like reading about the Magna Carta. They've heard about it, but they really don't know anything about it other than it's supposed to be important, but they don't necessarily know why. For those of you who were not around in 1967, let me give you a brief background of what happened. Some degree of rioting was expected that year, unfortunately. It seemed that the 1960s was a year of racial violence. And initially it started out with white violence against blacks, and the Freedom Rides and the Birmingham March and Selma are classic examples of that. But as the decade continued, it changed. The nature of that violence changed. And it appeared to be black violence directed at establishment. There had been riots in 65, there had been riots in 66, and the rhetoric from militants like Rat Brown had only gotten larger, louder, and harsher. So people were expecting trouble in 1967. But they still weren't prepared with what happened. By June of that year, there were over 100 riots in cities throughout the United States. And it was from Boston to Tampa to Tucson, and even Middle America, Des Moines, and Omaha. The nation seemed to be coming apart. But as scary as that wasn't the worst. On July 12th, police in Newark arrested a black cab driver for tailgating a police car. When reports surfaced that he had been beaten, the community descended and began what turned out to be a 5-day riot. Now, prior to that, most of the riots in the 1960s had only been 1-day or 2-day affairs, not 5 days. They called out the state police. That didn't stop it. They called the National Guard. That finally stopped it. After it was all said and done, 23 people were killed, which was 3 times more than all had been killed in the year before of the racial violence. 725 people had been injured. More than 250 fires had been set in Newark, which sounds like a lot, but think of this. Newark only has 26 square miles. So that is basically 10 fires for every square mile of Newark's territory. Law enforcement expended 13,000 rounds of ammunition in an attempt to stop the violence. 10 days later, another incident erupted, this time in Detroit. Again, not unlike Newark and really all the other incidents that happened in 1967, it started with seemingly a minor incident involving the police. The police raided an after-hours nightclub in Detroit. There were more people expected. There were more people in the club than was expected. Ironically and sadly, the reason why there were more people there in the club than what the police expected was that they were welcoming home a soldier from Vietnam who had just completed his tour of duty. Because there were more people there than what the police anticipated, they brought everybody outside, stood them on the corner until additional transportation could be arranged. It was a warm night in Detroit. Now, you think back to the 1960s, for those of us who were there in the 1960s, only 1 home out of 3 in America had air conditioning then. So there were already a lot of people outside in Detroit, standing on the corner, sitting on their front steps, or had their windows open. They either saw or heard what was going down. As you might imagine, they were upset with how they felt like they were being picked on just because they had an after-hours nightclub and because they were now arresting people who had turned out to welcome home one of their residents. After an hour, when the last of the arrestees had been transported away, someone broke a police car window throwing a bottle. That was then quickly followed up with someone smashing a storefront window with a trash can. And with that, another 5 days of violence came. And that violence made Newark's look insignificant. 43 people were killed. 7,200 people were arrested. There were over 680 fires started in Detroit. Almost 300 times the fire department had to temporarily withdraw from fighting a fire because they were either under attack from rocks and bottles or occasional sniper fire. State police, local police, the National Guard were not able to stop the rioting. It took 5,000 elite paratroopers from the U.S. Army, the 101 Airborne and the 82nd Airborne Divisions, who were so historically elite that they were among the first American GIs to be parachuted behind German lines on the first day of D-Day. That's the history of those 2 divisions. It took them to come in to stop the rioting, and they basically did it in a day. The visuals of what we saw on the news and in our news magazines was horrifying, and the impact was tremendous. We saw pictures of soldiers with brandishing bayonets crouched down behind cars and telephone poles. We saw lines of people being rounded up for arrest. We saw door-to-door and house-to-house searches. We saw skies lit with orange. We saw blocks and blocks of rubble and broken glass. And we saw scenes that looked like World War II cities had been bombed. The nation truly seemed to be coming apart. It was feared that the warnings of the black militants that an urban racial war had actually begun, and these were the opening shots. Responding to the crisis, President Johnson appointed an 11-member commission. It quickly became known as the Kerner Commission, after its chairman, Otto Kerner, the governor of Illinois. This commission and its staff worked nearly around the clock for 7 months. They utilized special reports from the FBI. They conducted groundbreaking research that involved studying the characteristics of 13,000 people who had been arrested. They did public opinion polling in riot areas. They conducted field investigations in 23 cities, and they utilized special census data. What they discovered was that the rioting was not caused by communists, hoodlums, drifters, or losers, as what 3/4 of white America believed, and what had always been previously been blamed for causing riots in earlier years, whether it was Watts in 1965 or Harlem in 1935. What they discovered was that the rioters were people who were lifelong residents of the city in which they rioted. They actually had gone to school longer than their average peer. They had a job, and their arrest record was no different than anyone else who lived in the community. In short, they were doing everything you were supposed to be doing to get ahead. But yet somehow, for some reason, they decided to risk it and participated in a riot. And what the commission concluded was that they were reacting to decades of pervasive discrimination and segregation. The commission and their staff saw countless examples of the disparity between white and black America, both in terms of the living conditions and the services that cities would provide. They would see mounds of garbage that hadn't been picked up for weeks in black neighborhoods. They saw vacant lots with broken glass and high weeds that were being passed off as parks. And when they would go to the cities and say, "Tell us about this. What are you doing about it?" they were often responded with claims of, "We don't have a problem. Our blacks are good blacks." The report shocked America. It dismayed America. It was something that was not expected. It's now regarded as perhaps one of the most important accounts of race in American history. Which takes us to today. Okay, so it's a historic document. It's nice to know that, and unless we're going on Jeopardy next week, we don't really need to know these facts or figures, do we? And it's one of the questions that I always get asked by my friends. So that's really great, Rick, that you're studying this. But to use a phrase that I heard a lot when I was going to college in the 1970s, what's the relevance? It doesn't take very long to thumb through these 600 pages to know that what the report is about are three things. It's going to be about police misconduct, it's going to be about inequitable opportunity and outcome, and it's going to be about a lack of awareness and understanding about past and present discrimination. As you know, those are the three things that we talk about extensively today in our public conversations. And when you dig a little bit deeper and you go into the commission's records, you see their correspondence and you read their meeting minutes, you see that they had the exact same concerns about these issues and use the exact same words that we use today to describe them. They worried about how hard it was to try to constructively criticize police without seemingly to condemn all police. They were aware that a segment of the population, no matter what they recommended, was going to say, slavery was over 100 years ago. Nobody owns slaves today. Why are we talking about this? They also recognized the difficulty in trying to put together an accurate and fair account of our racial past without denigrating our founding fathers or turning it into some sort of political manifesto. So what can we learn from this? Somehow, though, they managed to do this. They managed to address these emotional, sensitive issues and produce a unanimously adopted report that no one expected. Now, you can actually, fortunately, there's some things you can figure out. How did they do this, and what can we learn from this? And there are things that we can apply today, both in our public policy discussions, in our own work settings, regardless of where we work, and in our own personal relationships. In talking with staff, commission members, and reading interviews with commission members and their oral history accounts, we learned there's a number of rules that they follow. And they're good rules. They're rules that we should all follow every day. The first one is be courteous, be respectful. This group had some very frustrating, contentious discussions. They did not necessarily sit around the campfire and eat s'mores. but yet they always were very courteous. They did not fall into the habit of calling each other names. They didn't call one another socialists or racist, as is typically done today in political discussions. Instead, they also focused on what they had in common, not on what they didn't have in common. And they used that as the foundation. They then used that to step forward and go, okay, here's what we agree on. What we don't agree on is really not that small, and how can we address it? And they often found that it was based on semantics. And let me give you a classic example of that. In January, about 45 days before they were through with their report, they were considering a recommendation on how to address unemployment. And the proposed recommendation was, the best way to do this is to increase minimum wage. There were a couple of commissioners, not a majority, but a couple of them who were not happy, who were not comfortable with that wording. And one of the commissioners, who ironically was one of the more quiet members of the commission, spoke up and said, rather than saying it's the best way, why don't we just say it's one way? And they all instantly said, yes, that will work. Now, for a lot of us, you'll go, really? That was important? That changed their minds? As someone who spent 38 years working, as Aaron said, for and with state, local, and federal government, who drafted legislation that got approved by the Texas legislature and Congress, and I don't know how many local ordinances I wrote, that kind of slight word change means everything. It's hard to explain, it's hard to understand, but that's very real. One of the other things that the commission did, through the guidance of their executive director, David Ginsburg, who recognized early on that this report had to be unanimously adopted, or nearly unanimously adopted, was that he was going to create an environment where everybody felt like not only that their voice was heard, that they were listened to, that they could participate in, but that they could actually get their positions adopted. And over again, there would be opportunities or situations where Ginsburg, if he wanted to, he could have forced the issue and said, look, there's 7 of the 11 of you who are in agreement, we're moving on. We got too much to do, the clock is ticking. But he didn't. He would temporarily withdraw, he would tell the commission, staff will get back, we're going to address this again, we'll talk to a handful of you who have some concerns, and we'll see if we can do better. They did that over and over again. Now ultimately, sometimes they were able to persuade everybody and say, okay, they come up with new wording that made everybody feel comfortable. Sometimes they couldn't. But when they didn't, they still gave those people who were in the minority the feeling that they had succeeded and that they'd been heard. It's been joked that the Kerner Report was unanimously adopted by a 6-5 vote. And in many instances, that's what happened. But overall, there was enough buy-in, and everybody felt like in the end that they got at least probably 80% of what they wanted, that no one was willing to walk away. And again, that's in direct contrast to what we see today, where we seem to be, it has to be, I have to win, and it has to be on my terms, not yours. This is another example of how responsive and inclusive the commission tried to be. The commission's money was going to run out on March 1st. As you can see, these memos are dated February 18th to February 20th. They involved the writing of one paragraph in a report of 600 pages. They fired off 5 telegrams over a course of 3 days, with the last 3 being done in a 12-hour time frame. And as you can see, there's not a lot of wording that's being changed. And in fact, the last change that was done was in reference to a phrase that originally said mass protest movements. And they changed mass to some, so it said some protest movements. But again, that shows you how conscientious they were, even when the clock is running down on them, of trying to find the most optimal wording. There's something else we can learn from the report other than just how they went about doing their work. It's what's actually in the report itself. There are 80 pages in the report of statistics and tables, and there's many more pages of descriptive narrative that talks about how different white America is from black America. I think if someone were to pick up that report today and look at the statistics, they'd go, wow, look at that. 1 out of every 3 families in 1968 was in poverty. I wonder what it is now. So they go over and they'd look up on their laptop or their phone, and they'd find on the Census Bureau site, oh, it's down to 17%. We've cut it in half. That's really good. I knew we had done well. Until then you look down to the next line and you go, wow, but that's still 3 times more than the white rate. And then you skip down and you look and you go, black unemployment is still basically twice that of whites. Black household income is still stuck at about 2/3 of what it is for whites. There hasn't been much movement on black home ownership either, which is really significant in the long term when you think about that owning a home is the greatest source of wealth that most of us have. It also represents the greatest investment most of us ever make. So I'd like to think that people, when they start to look at this, if they go back to the report and try to update the findings, and they'll go, yes, I know we made progress, so the glass is half full now, and it wasn't that way once upon a time, they'll realize it's still half empty. I'd also like to think that as they go back and they look at Chapter 5 on African American history, they'll discover things that they weren't aware of. They'll discover how creative white America was at subjugating and disenfranchising blacks. The Texas Democratic Party, for instance, in the 40s, attempted to try to prohibit all blacks from voting, and they used the ruse that it was a private club membership. And as a private club, they could determine who was eligible to vote, who was not. You will also learn that something as venerable as the American Red Cross was party to all of this. Even after World War II, the American Red Cross still segregated black blood from white blood, even though Dr. Charles Drew was an African American and was really the pioneer in long-term plasma storage. I'd like to think that people, when they read that chapter, they'll go, I didn't know this. What else don't I know? And so maybe that will help them appreciate the need for why we have to have quality and appropriate African American history education in our schools. I'd like to think that with that knowledge of that we're not as far along as we thought we were, that there are things that we don't know, that maybe we won't be so as defensive and dismissive as we are when people bring up the specter of race and say, what about all these police shootings? Or I feel like I'm not getting a job because of how my name is. These are some examples of some very subtle, but I think very real ways in which discrimination is still practiced. A lot of these I have overheard firsthand, I've been told, or I've been told by African Americans that exist. And we know there's countless, many, many more examples of these insensitivities and barriers. I'd like to think again with this ability, and we also use this in conjunction with the techniques and the principles that the Kerner Commission did to facilitate consensus and discussion and agreement, that we might be able to go something else. We might be able to adopt a new terminology, a new vocabulary. Right now we use the term racist, it seems, as a one-size-fits-all label for both the white supremacist who spews racial hatred and then the white cashier who maybe engages in small talk with people who are Anglo, but not necessarily with people of color. Right now we seem to want to call them both the same thing, and we know that's not necessarily fair or accurate. We don't have a better terminology for that. In 1968, President Johnson hoped this would provide us, the Kerner Report would provide us with a path out of easily, as what NBC News said, was the most troubling period of American history since the Civil War. I don't think there's any doubt for those of us who are here now that the present day is the most contentious period since the 1960s. I'd like to think that once again the Kerner Commission might be able to provide us with a path out of the morass that we're in right now. I'd also like to thank all of you for sitting so patiently here for the last 25-30 minutes. I would like to sort of reciprocate. You've been kind enough to listen to me. I hope I've shared some information that's maybe new to you or expressed some concepts that maybe you've not really ever thought of before. But like I said, I like to reciprocate and see what you have to say, whether you have some questions or you have some comments. Thank you.
Anybody have any questions? I'll bring you the microphone so our folks online can also hear.
concept of the collegiality of the Kerner Commission, I think explains why Biden has done so successfully by always trying to make sure that both sides have a say in what happens.
Oh, absolutely. You know, I saw it, I spent most of my career working for Dallas County, which Dallas County is the county in Texas that contains Dallas and 28 other cities, and is population-wise the 9th largest county in the United States. We're governed by a 5-member group called the Commissioners Court. And for the first 20 years that I was there, it was governed by a Republican majority of 3-2 to 4-1. And then in the last 10 years, it was governed by a Democratic majority of 4-1. But we almost always strove for 5-0 votes. It's not unlike the Kerner Commission. And if we had a 4-1 vote over something, people would go, "Oh my God, what was this?" Because that because that was the culture, and the court members really made it a point, because they sat next to each other so closely and they worked together so closely, that that's what they strove for. And that was why I think we were successful in a lot of ways, in that we managed to get things done and focus on that collegiality aspect of it.
Thank you. Other? Yes.
Well, thank you for doing this, and obviously all your work over the years. Yeah, I mean, I'm struck, continue to be struck by the recalcitrant, I don't exactly know what it is, which is why I'm asking you the question, of white people in this country. That why is it so hard for us to acknowledge what is so, that this country is built on 400 years of free labor from black people. You know, you got the Germans, you know, that are willing to say, look, the Nazism was wrong. Now, obviously, people push against that, but you know, that's their historic stance. It was wrong. We don't make monuments to them. We have museums that show, that remind us of why it was wrong. And yet in this country, we do everything we can to bury black history, which is American history, I'm just, I'm at a loss for why, what's the matter with, you know, it's like, who was the famous, famous black writer who said that, you know, that white people we need to ask ourselves, what is it that we feel so bad about that that we have to like put a whole other race of people down so that we can be okay. So, you know who that is,
You're saying everything. I don't think anybody in this room disagrees with what you're saying. And I think one of the reasons why it's so hard to move beyond that over, let's say, the last 50 years, is because of something I made reference to just a few minutes ago. We still use the term racist. In the 1960s, it was very obvious, it was very easy to do, we thought, identify who the racists were. They were the guys who were wearing the white sheets, even when it wasn't Halloween. And they were the ones who didn't want blacks to move next door to them and harass black neighbors, or didn't want people, blacks, to be able to sit next to them in a restaurant. We've outlawed that, and so that's gone away. But there's still other discrimination that exists, and yet we still call everybody a racist. And that is an understandably pejorative term, but we need to figure out how do we address these other forms of discrimination that isn't based on white supremacy, but just get people to admit that, you know, what you're saying is just insensitive or it's wrong. And, you know, that's one of those where I know we've tried to have some national leadership in the past on that. It hasn't always been consistent. I don't think we've necessarily had good corporate leadership on that. I don't think we've necessarily had good religious leadership consistently on that. It's going to take all aspects of American life, and my wife and I talk about it regularly about how can we change. And all change starts at the individual level. And it's something that I've tried to increasingly become more aware of, given the times that we're living in, by trying to practice what I preach. And trying not to go off when I have somebody, a neighbor, talking about X, Y, or Z. I try not to remain silent, and but I will try to, I don't let it pass, but I try to address it in a meaningful, hopefully constructive way of, I understand what you're saying, but do you hear how it sounds? And just some things like that. It's going to be a long process. It's one of those that when you look at it in the historical context, it's now only been 130 years since slavery was ended, which in the historical scheme of things is not very long. And it took 100 years for it to pass before blacks could sit next to us, whites, in restaurants. So maybe looking now 50 years later, it shouldn't be surprising to us that black home ownership and black income is still stuck where it is. As one of my former boss used to say, 50 seems like a long time ago until you turn 50, and then you realize that it's not a long time. I fear that a lot of us have thought, because we have grown up and with more contact with African Americans than we ever did before. You know, when I was a child, the only African Americans I ever saw were custodians at school or the sanitation workers. We of course now see them in, you know, our offices, our schools, everywhere. It's not unusual. Our neighbors, you know, that's all progress. But I think a lot of us have taken that for granted, that it was always going to happen and continue, and that it was going to be a gradual path towards parity. We took it for granted, and every once in a while we get shocked into realizing that maybe we're not as far along, whether it was a Rodney King situation or a Ferguson situation. I think the last 5+ years we've seen that we really shouldn't take anything in this country for granted. And I think it's something that we have to actively all work for on an individual basis, rather than just assume, well, Congress will take care of it, or the courts will take care of it, or whatever. I think we have to be involved in a variety of the ways that we interact with people, and whether we vote, and whether we participate in local affairs, things like that.
Thank you. We've got two on this side of the room.
Yes, Rick, I'm Kevin Johnson. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin.
This was very good. And as I've gotten older and just noticed a lot of things, you brought up the subject of racism, so forth, and everybody. First of all, everybody is not a racist. All white people are not racist. There's a difference between racism and bigotry. Racism is a system, and we have to understand that it's an evil system. It's not a good system. It's not legal. Bigotry is just like if you live in a neighborhood, you don't want this person near you, or you don't like that person. You can't really contact them unless they say something. But racism is a power structure. Everybody's not a part of that power structure. Everybody doesn't push the actual buttons in that. And today we have a shift of even black people getting into this realm of bigotry, and I'm seeing it right now. Just to give you an example of the Caitlin Clark situation, where this young white female who was doing extremely well in the circle, and then a lot of the black stars are going against her and so forth. But if it was changed on the other end, if it was different, you know, it would be a huge uprising, and blacks would be protesting here and there and so forth. But a lot of things have changed, and people need to acknowledge it. They have changed. Racism will never go away. Racism is an evil. It's nothing, it's not a person putting on a suit, standing on a podium and so forth. it's an evil, and these things can only be changed by the heart. It can't be legislated away. You can't vote it away. You can't say, okay, let's have better real estate policies. You can't do that to get rid of it. A person's heart has to be changed. And only God can do that. Only God can do that. And just like I say, you could, with bigotry, I mean, you don't even have to, what can I say? You don't even have to pay more attention to that, because a lot of things that are going on now, you don't really see it because it's so subtle.
It is.
It's more covert now. Years ago, it was overt. And when these riots were happening, I was in kindergarten when these were happening. It happened in Philadelphia, where I'm from. But a lot of these things were, a lot of the suffering was so direct in the neighborhoods. And even if it wasn't happening in a particular neighborhood, most black people in communities felt it. On their jobs, people leaving their jobs. I had for example, and I'll be done. For example, my sister was, she was working at an insurance company in Philadelphia. She came home and they told her that she was going to get the supervisory position. So she came home and she was very happy, so forth and so on, and I got this job. She came back and they told her to train another young lady for the position that she thought she was going to get.
Oh my.
So she did not get the position, So these things were, but then again, that's not illegal. So it's very covert, and that's what we're dealing with now. So
Yes.
very covert,
Yes.
where this was, I think the Kerner Commission, I think you would say, it was more overt.
Yes.
These were overt situations. So that's my, that's just my take on that.
Thank you for your talk, very informative. So one thing that exists now that didn't exist at the time of the Kerner Commission is this extremely sort of bifurcated and segregated media market.
Yes.
Where we're not even getting the same information as other segments of our society. So what's your sort of take on that with regards to the future of civil discourse?
That is a huge concern that I have. I started life as a journalism major in college, and that's what I was for my first 2 years. And all we have to see is how few, first of all, most cities only have one newspaper now, as opposed to having a morning paper and an evening paper. And even the one paper that survives now is so much thinner than it used to be. I worry about that greatly on the coverage of local affairs, because obviously CNN isn't going to cover the school board and wherever, and so we don't even have that opportunity for a lot of us. Again, because we don't have that shared natural experience for news as we did in the 60s and the 70s, where we all watched the same, basically, it's the same flavor of chocolate or vanilla, whatever you wanted to call ABC, CBS, or NBC. You knew they were going to report pretty much the same way. And it's going to be very straightforward and not opinionated. And generally, I believe, they were presenting something what they thought was factual. That's obviously not necessarily the case today. And social media is not necessarily of help either. So again, to me, it gets back to the individual and what kind of standard that we do. The responsibility is always on us. It's on us. We now have more access to information than we've ever had before. I will periodically look at sites that I don't necessarily always agree with, because I want to see what's being presented. I want to know, am I missing something? Or how is it, where are they coming from? Maybe there's something that I've not been aware of, whether it's a fact or a different outlook. And I do that for even the sources that I am. I guess was naturally born to be a skeptic, but I never take anything at face value. I wish more people did, but that's really what it's going to take is, again, in the world that we live in with media. And again, the reference that I made to the call that we need really good, strong national leadership from our religious figures, our corporate leaders, our elected officials. I'm not sure what we're going to get from them. But at least the others we might be able to try to expect more or hope more from.
were saying that you think this book should be read today.
Yes.
As a way to move forward, and I was wondering if you think this should be implemented in schools, and if so, I know that banned books are a thing. Do you think that this book would be accepted in education today?
Oh, there's no doubt in my mind this would be regarded as critical race
Yeah.
theory. In fact, there's I recently was lucky enough to write a book about how the Commission did its work. And there's a chapter on there on the writing of Chapter 5, and I conclude with it, would it be considered as critical race theory? And technically, it is not critical race theory, but we all know it would be accepted as critical race theory.
Any additional? So I'm going to ask mine as I walk across the room. If a similar report was requested today to be held, what do you think a key finding might be?
Oh my. First of all, unless you packed the commission, which meant then it probably would be automatically dismissed by half the nation, regardless of who you packed it with, that would be the first problem. The other is if you tried to have it be some sort of genuine bipartisan type thing, you know, not to be sarcastic, I wonder if you could find enough of either party to where you could fill out a committee that way.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was curious, just what your thoughts were with blind applications and things like that we're starting to think about with entrances to things, you know, and like what the positives and negatives are for that, and you know how just your thoughts on that.
That is a very interesting thing because, you know, I've read studies where if you have applicants who have, you know, the plain vanilla, you know, Mary and John Smith kind of names, and then somebody else who has a more African sounding name, or let's say an Arab sounding name, how they get rejected. And they can have basically the same credentials. They get rejected at significant rates different than the John and Mary Smiths. I'd hate to think that we have to do that. I fear that if we institutionalize that, then we've accepted the fact that we've got a problem. And I don't know, I find that troubling.
Thank you.
Yeah, so the author I was thinking was James Baldwin. So, you know, he was obviously a genius. So I thought I heard you say that when you were responding to my comment that the current system is not based on white supremacy.
No, if I did say that, then I'm sorry. I shouldn't have, all right? I shouldn't have implied that or inferred that. I think there is no doubt I think a lot of us should recognize that there are things in our system that inherently favor the status quo. And some of that was originally racially based, some of it is not, but that's the impact. You know, to me words matter, and I hate to, and it makes me queasy when I hear certain terms used. It's not to say that I don't disagree with what is being said, but I'd like to think that there's a better way of saying it. So.
Okay, so, yeah,
I think you and I are on the same page.
I hear you, and but in your response to this young lady's comment about you would hate to see that legislated because it would be a problem, and that connects me to this young man's comment about you know, that racism is an evil that needs to be, that the heart needs to be, you know, I can't go there because I don't know what it's going to take, but I do feel like legislation has to take place for us to move forward because these things don't just change by themselves.
You know, and I don't disagree. And the thing is what type of legislation and how the form it needs to take. As Kevin said, there are certain things you can't legislate, but there are certain things that you need to make sure. I just fear that if we were to legislate something like blind applications, then all that for basically half of America, they're going to be so predisposed to not wanting to change that it's only going to make matters worse. We're going to become more divisive than unified.
So do you think that when, we said, no, everybody gets to stay at hotels, everybody gets to eat at restaurants, everybody gets to go to school, all these kind of things, do you think those were negative steps that we took?
Oh, no, not at all, not at all. Those were absolutely, they were long overdue. What I would like to see is, I'd like to think, and maybe I'm too much of a Pollyanna, I'd like to think that a lot of the people who say and do things that are insensitive clearly don't have a clue as to what they're doing. And I wish DEI didn't have such a bad reputation in certain circles now, because I think that could be the really good mechanism by which we can try to help explain things to people. And it's also unfortunate that DEI is cast really in a black versus white sort of environment, as opposed to making it multicultural and talking about why certain religions do what they do, why the practitioners of certain religions pray however many times a day, or they have a headdress on, or I grew up as Catholic, and why for the longest time that we couldn't eat meat on Fridays. I think people would like to know, if you made it more of a enlightening situation where let's find out more about life and each other, as opposed to, and I think a lot of people view DEI as, oh, you're going to lecture me and you're going to make me feel guilty. Well, maybe you need to feel guilty, but that's not really the intention of what we're doing here. I think that might be a way to try to address some of the things that you and some of the others have brought up today.
Well, again, I agree with you. I'm a physician, and this will be my last comment about.
Oh, make more.
Okay, so in my work, I work a lot in health equity, and also and so in those spaces, I'm always kind of shocked that they typically put a black person at the tip of that spear. Even here at Duke, and what troubles me about that is those are my colleagues, so they'll we can talk, and to see the kind of stress they're under, to not only sort of try to wake white people up to these inequities, also have their hands out to take a few crumbs from a medical establishment that it's got some extra to share. And then compound upon that is generational trauma that gets passed down, on a physiologic level in this journey. So, the consequences of this kind of behavior is real, and takes a huge toll on, obviously we all notice, our society and one another's. I mean, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. Anyway, thank you.
We do have a comment from online, and so it's more of a comment, not a question, but if I'm going to address it as well. It's downplaying someone's racism can perpetuate harmful beliefs and prevent constructive conversations. It's important to address these issues directly, as uncomfortable as it might be, to encourage understanding and growth. Open dialogue can lead to greater awareness and positive change.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It's whether some of us in this room have been parents,
Right.
and there's certain things you just can't allow pass, but we take the easy way out. But if you don't tell your child or call them on it, they have no idea of knowing that what they're doing is inappropriate, and that will just continue.
A response to that is, I also acknowledge that different times and different situations, I respond differently with the same action that my child might have done.
I treated my son so much worse than I ever treated anybody at work.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
When was it published?
March 1st, 1968.
So that was before Martin Luther King was shot.
Just by about 30 days.
They had riots after that too, and
Yes, they
here in
did.
Durham happened, and burned stores on 9th Street and stuff like that. And that was what really shocked me at the time. We'd seen a past summer of riots all over the place. I didn't think it would ever happen here.
When Dr. King was killed and you had that wave of rioting across the U.S., for a lot of people, they believed, they feared that what had been prophesized here was coming true. That this was going to be the way that it was. For a number of reasons, however, 1968 was the last wave that we've really experienced since.
So I'd like to thank you again, Rick, for coming
Well, thank you.
to Duke. Anybody have questions after? Or we'll continue, but thank you.
Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for joining us online today. We appreciate it.